Hello, Jennifer. Thank you for taking the time. Highly appreciate it. I would like to focus on power in a negotiation because reading your articles, watching your video clips on YouTube, you talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of power. So what is good about power in leadership?
Yeah. So, there's many good things, Matthias. The first thing is that people want it, right? So it's something that most people desire. And that varies by person, it varies by culture. But for the most part, people want it because it gives you things. When you have power, people are more likely to listen to you. When you have power, you're more likely to get things that you want. And why power is good is it actually makes you think that things are better in life. So people that are powerful are more optimistic. People that are powerful tend to feel like they're invulnerable. People who are powerful are more goal-oriented, so they tend to be more focused on their goals. So there's many, if you think about the way that I define power, as well as many other scholars in the field, we say that power is essentially control over things that other people want. So as soon as you get those things that other people want, there's some kind of an enhancement that comes along with that. Physical, right? We can get things that physically enhance us, but there's also things that come with power that mentally enhance us. As I said, like this more optimistic mindset, more goal orientation, etc.
Sounds a little bit like manipulation.
No, you can use power, right? So I think about power as something you have. It is a construct that you either possess or you don't. Now you can use that power to harm or help others. So we think about, and I say we, like scholars that study power, we think about power as a magnifying glass. If you have benevolent intentions, power makes you more benevolent. So if we think about, the great benefactors or philanthropists of the world, most of them are very powerful, right? And they do amazing things with their power. And yet we also can think about throughout history, many powerful people who did very bad things with their power. And that's personally for me how I distinguish power wielders and leaders. So power wielders are people who use their power for their own self-benefit, their own self-aggrandizement. And leaders are people who use power for the well-being of others.
Okay.
They use it for leadership, which is, to me, the ability to motivate, enable, and influence people to reach a common good or a shared purpose.
Okay. Let's talk about the ugly things of power. What is ugly about power?
I think, as you said, right, you can use power to manipulate, but power also has, so we can start by saying power is transformative. It transforms us in good ways, but it also can transform us in negative ways. So power, for example, makes us more hypocritical. The powerful think that they can do things that the less powerful cannot, or can do things and get away with it that the less powerful cannot. Power makes us less empathetic. We're less likely to be able to understand the mindset or emotions of others as soon as we get power. And I even mean here, which is really interesting, it's like experimentally induced power. So you come into the laboratory, you're like everybody else, and we tell you, Matthias, the next session, you're going to have power over the other people in the room. You're going to be the manager, and they're going to be the employees. Just having that instruction changes the way that people act. So people, as I said, people can be more hypocritical. They can be less empathetic. They can also tend to make decisions that are benefiting the self and ignoring the other, and that has to do with the empathy, right? You tend to be more self-focused, more focused inward when you have power, and more focused outward when you lack power.
Is there a difference between female and male leaders? Because it sounds a little bit like power is great. So my first impression is I was thinking about some men, not about.
Yeah. So I think there's two different questions there. One is how do men and women use power, and then the other one is how do men and women lead? And I think those are two different questions, right? Because you can possess power and not be a leader. As I said, you can possess power and be a power wielder, and you can possess power and be a leader. So what I would say, what we know is that when men and women possess power, they actually act very, very similar. Now, the difference is that throughout history, it's more likely that men have had power than women. So we tend to attribute these things that come along with power more towards men than to women, but power has equally transformative effects on women as it does on men. So here's an interesting, may I share a study that we did a few years ago with you. So what we did is that we looked at both men and women that possess structural power. So power in sort of a system, in a hierarchy. And we looked at their likelihood of engaging in infidelity.
Okay.
And there was always there has been this hypothesis that men are more likely to be unfaithful than women. And yes, that's true, but when you control for power, actually men and women are equal. So it's more of a power effect than it is a gender effect. But we often think it's a gender effect merely because in most cases, it's the men who possess the power. So I would actually say that power has much more effects on human behavior than does gender. It's just that power is more likely to be possessed by some genders than by others.
Okay, understood. And this brings me to my next question. You mentioned that if you tell someone, okay, in the next session you will be the leader, they change the mindset. And what we see very often that leaders, they don't negotiate with the opponent party, they negotiate with...
Through somebody.
Yeah. No, they do this guessing game. They negotiate with themselves, about what could be possible. No, I think I'm not allowed to ask this or that. So negotiating with yourself will put yourself in a very weak position.
Okay, so in a way, I want to make sure I understand, Matthias, what you're saying. You're saying almost like they try to first convince themselves in a way that what they need or what they're doing is right? Yeah,
and so this is my personal observation. If you think about what is possible, should I ask for this or that? Am I allowed to come up with this demand?
Yeah.
Then you weaken your position.
For sure.
And
for sure.
If a leader is, let's say, very convinced, they don't negotiate with themselves.
Yes.
They start a negotiation with the other party.
Yes.
But most leaders, they do this guessing game, which is, from our perspective, wrong. Would you agree?
Yeah. So I guess I would label it something different. I would call it almost like a game of self-doubt rather than a guessing game, maybe, or a game of testing what your band of allowed behavior is. And again, I'm very strict with who I call a leader. So I really call a leader somebody who's working for this common good, to get people moving towards a common good, collectively moving towards a common good. But I would say that people who are in power positions, yes, some are more likely to do this kind of self-negotiation or self-doubt talk before negotiation. Am I allowed to do this? Do I deserve this? Am I allowed to ask for this? And now with that question, there are big gender differences. So we know a lot in negotiation that women, for example, are more likely to ask for less. Women don't think they deserve as much as men do. Women are more likely to think, I should be happy with what I have. So I'm not sure if that's a leadership conversation, but more of a gender conversation about what you ask for and what you think you deserve in a situation. And it extends outside of a negotiation, right? In life, we know that women traditionally tend to expect less out of life and tend to ask for what they want less.
Okay. So how to prepare yourself for a difficult negotiation as a leader? How to put yourself in this positive, powerful mindset without being arrogant or...
Okay, so good question, Matthias. I think for me, that has so much to do with your personality.
Okay.
So, if you already have this kind of power mindset that I deserve things, that I should have this outcome, I think it's less of an issue for you. And we can also see leaders that are sort of self-convinced, right? They sit down at the table and you can feel that they are convinced that they should get this outcome. And then you feel people that have more self-doubt. I'm definitely one of those people that has more self-doubt. So for me, I need to pile up that evidence for why I should ask for this or why I should get this. And so for some leaders who possess that self-doubt, really having that hard evidence, writing down the 5 reasons you think you deserve this outcome can be really helpful for a mindset of empowerment.
So in writing?
In writing, put it down, right? See it in front of you and say, okay, yeah, this is why I deserve that raise, or this is why I deserve to have this amount for whatever I'm selling or whatever I'm asking for. Yeah.
Should I ask friends? Should I communicate my concerns or?
I think it's all about who your anchor is, right? So if you ask your friends who are really good at asking for what they want. So for example, as I said, I possess a lot of self-doubt. So I have a coach that if I really want to ask for something big, I'm going to ask for him. I'm going to ask him, what would you ask for? Because I know he would always go for what he believes he deserves or what he thinks I deserve, right? So I will ask him to give me that courage to ask. But if I ask a friend of mine or a colleague of mine who tends to have the same level of self-doubt as me, they're going to set the anchor rather low. So I think it depends on who you ask, right? Are you asking someone that helps to set the anchor high? Yeah.
So you need to ask someone
who
is supporting you.
who supports you in terms of being ambitious with your goal, right?
Okay.
With your target, right? In negotiation, it's called your target, right? Being ambitious with the target.
Okay. So so our focus is always difficult negotiations, and what we see that most organizations that they don't switch from the usual daily business behavior to a crisis behavior. Do you agree?
That they struggle to make that switch.
Yep.
And that makes, what is the connection between the lack of that switch and a difficult negotiation? I'm just struggling to make the connection.
So in the daily business negotiation, you work in your, let's say, organizational behavior.
Your comfort zone.
Yeah, and it's more like an organizational setup. So you have a key account manager, you have a sales director, so you have your organization running.
Okay, yeah.
And then in the usual negotiation, you send in your key account manager for the price negotiation, the sales director is responsible for the relationship, all that stuff.
So people are very like functional in their roles.
Exactly, functional.
Okay.
And so based on our experience, in a crisis negotiation, you need to come up with a crisis negotiation team. So a key account manager should not negotiate the price, because these guys are so relationship oriented that they want to, or they make concessions to be loved.
Yeah.
So based on our experience, we always change the system. So what's your experience? Because
really interesting.
They don't realize it, or they don't see it, or they don't want to change it. And then they wake up in a crisis, and then they realize, oh my God, what should I do now?
Yes.
What's your experience?
That's a really interesting perspective. I guess, Matthias, I'm a bit more broad in my thinking of what are people's potentials. So as an organizational behaviorist, I really do believe that we might make assumptions, right? Like the key account manager, they really value relationships. But I think that's an assumption. I think there are people that are in roles that are very relationship-based that also can be very hardline in terms of what they need. So I think it's a really interesting idea of building the separate team. I'm not sure I would make the same conclusion that just because someone is in one role today, they can't make that leap to this other role. Because we know as psychologists that individuals have different needs. Some of the main needs we have as leaders is need for power. Some of us have that. I need to be dominant over others. I need to be respected, be admired. Some people have a need for achievement. I need to get that goal. I need to show what I know. And some people have a need for affiliation. I need to be liked. And most of us have one or two of these that are dominant. And interestingly, they don't correlate with gender. It's not that women are more likely to have a need for affiliation, et cetera. And it doesn't seem to correlate as well with certain roles. Now, of course, if you're a CEO or probably a crisis negotiator and you have a strong need for affiliation, that's probably going to get in the way of getting your outcomes. But I wouldn't always make the assumption that just because someone is in one role, they can't necessarily make that jump to be in this kind of crisis negotiator role.
How can I test it as a leader?
How can you test it? I think you can start to look. I mean, just hearing those three buckets, right? Need for affiliation, need for power, need for achievement. You can get a good feeling of where people are. People that tend to really emphasize the relationship over the outcome tend to be people that are really good with making connections. They're really good with staying in touch with people, but they're also really good at conforming. So these tend to be the people that conform. They change the behavior based on the person across the table from them, and they're also really hard. They really have a hard time saying no to somebody or asking for more if they're afraid that it will hurt the relationship. So I think people that you start to notice, okay, they make concessions in order to maintain that relationship. Obviously, it's not someone you would want to put on a hardline negotiation team or a crisis negotiation team, as you put it. I think it's also cultural, right? I think for me, I've lived in the US, I've lived in the Netherlands. They tend to be pretty low context cultures, tend to be more direct. And then I've worked in Japan, right? Where merely saying no to somebody is a personal affront and a way potentially to ruin a relationship. So I think it's also very cultural. What does it mean to be need for affiliation or not, right? What that means in different cultures is something different.
Okay. Another element we experienced that most leaders, they see a difficult negotiation as a problem, not as a possibility to do something better for the world. Do you agree? I
think it has a lot to do with how much they form that idea of the difficult negotiation as a challenge for them versus a threat. So psychologists, we as psychologists also know that there are sort of two groups of people in terms of how you react to challenges in your environment. Either I see it as an opportunity to grow and to learn and to do something better, or I see it as a threat. And there's a lot of influences that go into, are you in one box or another? I wouldn't say in my experience, Matthias, that more managers fall into the hard situation as a threat, or the difficult negotiation in this case as a threat versus a challenge. I think it really is an individual difference, and I've seen the whole breadth or range of behavior or range of approach in the leaders I work with. Certainly, those who do see it as a challenge are better off, and they often have better outcomes in life and in business than those who see it as a threat, for sure.
Yeah. During this crisis right now, we see a lot of leaders. They don't make decisions at all. They try to avoid that. They do have this excuse: I need more information. I need more about the subject. From my perspective, it's just an excuse, not make a mistake and in not making a decision.
Are you asking my opinion on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I think for me, it has so much to do, right, with the culture around them. I'm an organizational psychologist, right? So I also think about the context around a leader, not just the leader themselves, because it's always an interaction between the two, right? You put someone with one personality in one situation, they act very different than in another. So I'm always looking at the context. And for me, the situations or the contexts that induce leaders to avoid decision-making are those that are cultures of blame. Whereas it's not about, I was raised as a behavioral psychologist. So we do a lot of experiments. And so we try something out. Sometimes our hypothesis is confirmed, sometimes it's not. It's not that when it's not confirmed, it's a failure. When I work with many organizations, when something is not confirmed or supported, it's a failure. And I think, when you're in that kind of environment, if you try something, if you go out there in a negotiation and it doesn't work out, you're seen as a failure. And so I'm not going to want to make decisions because it's just one more opportunity for me to be blamed. Now in environments, I'm sure you've heard the term psychological safety. In environments where there is a psychological safety, right? I'm going to support you if you're going to go out and try something, Matthias, because I believe in you. And I believe that what you're doing ultimately will help the company. Maybe not in the first iteration, but in the second and the third. In those situations, people are much more likely to take responsibility and to want to be accountable for decisions because they see it as an opportunity to shine, not as an opportunity to get blamed or to get punished.
Okay, this is not my observation.
Okay, I get that.
In difficult negotiations, we see that leaders, they should send in a negotiation team with a clear target. So this is what we want, and this is our walk-away position. This is your license to negotiate. And this is also an agreement. It's also a decision. And what we see very often, that leaders are telling the negotiation team, let's try to get the best out of this deal. Mm-hmm. So it's very vague, it's not a specific target.
Yeah.
Why is that?
So, okay, I want to first just respond to the sending in a team, right? And said, because there's a lot of literature, I'm sure you know even more than me on, negotiating through an agent, right? You're not going to negotiate directly, you're going to have an agent negotiate on your behalf. And the reason that many people do that is exactly what you said, right? You detach emotion from it. All of a sudden, when you send someone else in for you, you're less likely to have that emotional attachment. You're less likely to care about the relationship, and so give concessions, etc. I think there's also, as a social psychologist, and we talked about I was a former ethicist, I also see some danger in that, in the sense that, number one, I think emotions are really critical. I understand sometimes in negotiations, you want to make decisions as void of emotions as possible. But I also think it's not only about, can I go in and not have any emotions, not have any attachment to you, Matthias, when I negotiate with you, but more about, can I train myself to control those emotions and sometimes acknowledge them to say, okay, right now, you know what, I really want to give in to you because I want to keep the relationship. But I've trained myself. I know now how to act void of those emotions or putting those emotions aside. As I said, as an ethicist, I've also seen many situations where agents, they go for that best outcome, but because they're not necessarily the principal, they don't have those same ethical concerns. And sometimes unethical things can happen in that negotiation when you yourself are not the negotiator. because they have one target just to get to that best outcome, whereas you as the principal perhaps have other, like upholding certain values that you want to bring in. So I think to me, it's not black or white. Yes, you might get a better outcome because you have less emotion when you're not negotiating yourself. But I think there's also other downsides that might come in when you are not negotiating, or when someone's negotiating on your behalf, when you are not the one negotiating.
Okay, that's very interesting. And brings me to the next question. How do I control my negotiation team in a tough negotiation, in a crisis? When and how to interfere and to step in, and what's your idea?
I mean, I think, okay, so essentially, I'm not a negotiation expert, you are, but one thing I do study is power, right? And you can have power, but you can also share power. You can empower people. So the lesson about empowerment is essentially to make it work, to share power, which, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is I need to empower my negotiation team. They're going out there on my behalf. 4 things have to be present. The first thing is a clear frame, right? The frame is essentially empowerment is freedom within a frame. I'm going to tell you what you need to do. I'm going to give you a frame. Those are going to be the parameters, what I want to get out of it, maybe how long we have, etc. Whatever the parameters are. If you've worked with that team a long time and they think along with you, maybe that frame can be really thin. If you haven't worked with them before, maybe you need to make that frame really thick. Okay. So essentially, okay, I'm going to give them a frame. Perhaps, if values are really critical, as I said, our family is part of a family company, and I can see for them values are very critical. So even if an agent went in a negotiation and they got the best outcome, but the company values weren't upheld, that would be a failure to them. So I think values could be part of that frame. And then you need to have feedback, right? So they go out there and they negotiate on your behalf. What feedback do you give them after? Do you do an after session debrief, and kind of where are you wanting to give them direction about where to go in the future? The other one is psychological safety. We talked about this earlier. Do they feel comfortable to come to you and to ask questions and to say, okay, if this happens, what do you want us to do in this case? So do they feel that psychological safety with you? And then, as you said, these kind of checkpoints during the way. Do you want to have a checkpoint after you have the negotiation? Do we need to have a check-in during the negotiation to kind of say how things are going? And so in your mind, as the principal, giving that really clear direction about, okay, this is how I want to check in with you because I want to have more or less control. And of course, the check-in points have some correlation with the thickness of the frame. The more thick the frame, maybe the more I'm going to check in. The more thin the frame, the less I need to have that hands-on interaction with you.
You mentioned company values. What to do if I disagree as a leader with company values?
With my company values.
With my company.
I think that is like a fundamental question we talk about in leadership, in the sense that, when you walk into an organization as a manager at any level, how much do you leave your own values at the door and adopt the company values, or how much do you bring your values in? And I actually had an interesting reflection from one of my MBA students. She said, well, if everybody, as they walk in the door, just accepts the company values, don't we just have an organization of robots? Essentially people that are making the same decisions because they're all using the same system to decide whether or not it's right or wrong. And I thought it was a really good reflection. It is an age-old question. I don't think there is a right or wrong. I think it's a very gray zone. For me personally, I don't think it's reasonable to say I walk in and I discard my own values and I now all of a sudden take the company values. I would say the ideal situation is you really think about those company values when you join a company, and you say, how much can I espouse these company values? How much can I uphold these and really embody them on my decision making? And if you can't, it's normally not a good fit. Maybe you're going to be there a couple of years, but there's certainly not going to be a long-term future for you with that organization. So I would say, if you fundamentally disagree with the values of the organization that you work for, probably they're not going to be the ones that are explicit, because the explicit values of every company are like pretty much all the same. They're very everyone could adopt them. To me, they're much more the descriptive values. So we have the injunctive values, kind of like what people say, right? What the company says. And then you have the descriptive values. What do leaders actually there do when it comes to their behavior? And I think if you fundamentally disagree with the way that a company operates based on a value system, you have 2 options. One is to speak up and say, I disagree, I would like to do something differently. And the other one essentially is to find another organization where you do uphold the values.
if you're really happy with your organization, however, you need to take over, let's say, a business unit in America. If you are, let's say, Swiss, negotiating with American partner, which usually there's more confrontation, there's more the fish on the table, as our dear friend George would say. So I'm happy with my company values, and now I need to negotiate for my business unit in America. What should I do?
Yeah, so I think the question there, I mean, it's not only Swiss American, it's really your culture and then any other culture, right? And of course, there's an ethical component to that. So let's say I have to go down to Brazil and negotiate, and maybe they say, you know what, we can get this. You have to give us a little bit extra under the table, right?
Yeah.
So there are sometimes, in different cultures, different things are acceptable, and they're completely ethical in that culture, but based on your company values, unethical. And I think there, obviously, you have to uphold the company values. You cannot adapt yourself to the culture in which you are operating. And we, of course, have seen many companies that have not done that, and they get into a lot of trouble. I would also say, though, if the behavior that you need to adapt to is within some kind of ethical sphere of what is acceptable, then it is responsible for you to adapt. So, for example, I gave the example of Japan. As an American and someone who lived in the Netherlands, very straightforward, quite direct. Sometimes, the Dutch can seem even a little bit rude because they're so direct. And now when I go into Japan and work with a client, I'm constantly thinking about how do I need to adapt my behavior to meet the values or the expected behaviors of my counterpart in that culture. And it doesn't mean that I'm fundamentally changing who I am. I'm thinking, given who I am, how do I make adaptations? And what's interesting about psychology is that we connect more with people that are similar to us. And that can be, similar in terms of attributes. Like we come from the same place, we come from the same culture, we have a similar education, maybe we look the same, etc. But they can also be similarities in terms of behavior. So we know that we start to mirror people that we start to mirror other people's behavior. And so if we start to mirror and use the same kind of physical behaviors of the people that we're negotiating against, they sit back, we sit back. It's not on a conscious level, but we're going to feel more similar to that person. And it's going to lead us to feel more connection. And so I would say, unless it's outside of your ethical boundaries, then there is some responsibility that you meet. For example, if you're Swiss and you go to America, you meet the behaviors of the people that you are negotiating with. Now, another option is, of course, to kind of put the fish on the table at the beginning and say, I know you're American, I'm Swiss, we have a different way of negotiating. So just to understand this, when I'm negotiating with you and using these behaviors, it is in no way saying that I'm more relaxed about this, or it's not as important to me, or what have you, whatever it might be. But sometimes it does help, actually, and there's data on this. It does help to put those differences on the table so the other person, it makes it easier for the other person to read your emotions and to read your behavior and not to misconstrue it.
Okay. You talked previously about politics, about boundaries, about the gray zone. We talked about the former president, Donald Trump. So
I'm not sure if I want to go on the record talking about my former president.
So what is a boundary in leadership? What is gray zone in leadership? How would you describe it?
So, a gray zone for me is anything that is outside of legal boundaries. So it's not illegal or legal, but it can be ethical or unethical, right? And if you want to talk about politics, we can think about within America, right? It was illegal for a black person to sit on a bus and not give that seat to a white person. They could get arrested. Now, was that behavior ethical? And those are two different things, right? What is legal in a country is not always what is ethical. So to me, that gray zone is what is outside of legal boundaries, but has clear implications for what is right or wrong. Now, what I define ethical or unethical is ethical behavior is behavior that is beneficial or helpful to people, that helps people. And unethical behavior is behavior that harms. Now, that is also a total gray zone. What helps or harms is also subjective. So we are in the super gray zone when we start to get into ethics. Yeah.
Okay. So looking into the future, what is your expectation? What's important for the leader in the future?
Yeah. I think, okay, so what's important, this is now we're really switching. Do you mind if I just answer that question about boundaries?
Sure.
Because we got into the gray zone, we never really answered boundaries.
Sorry.
So to me, I think there are two levels of boundaries. One is, it can be, as you said, if I'm negotiating on your behalf, you've given me a certain frame that I cannot go beyond, right? That could be an upper limit, that could be a lower limit, whatever. So there could be explicit boundaries. But then there's also kind of an emotional boundary, right? When in a negotiation am I starting to feel uncomfortable? And it might be, we talked about emotions, right? It might be I'm starting to feel sick to my stomach. I'm starting to get sweaty. I'm starting to get, feel like what I'm doing is not right. To me, that is data. And that's really important to say, okay, am I crossing a boundary? It might be just out of my comfort zone. Maybe I'm doing something that's not in my comfort zone and therefore I want to keep doing it. But it might also mean that I'm challenging some kind of a moral limit that I have, right? So to me, those kind of emotions could be boundaries. You can have physical or structural boundaries of a negotiation, but you can also have personal boundaries. And there's certain indicators of that. And many of those indicators are kind of emotional or physical indicators that we start to feel. Now you said, what do leaders need for the future? That's a whole nother question. A lot of what I do actually at IMD is leading in the digital age. So leaders that are leading in a time of digital disruption. And essentially what we find is that leaders need many kind of new skills, but some of these things are things we've known for many years. So leaders in the future need to be really good listeners because there's so much going on. They need to be picking up on all these different directions in which things are moving. They need to be adaptable in their behavior, not just constant. They need to be really what we call prospectors, going out there. And that's a little bit like listening, going out there and kind of seeing where there are opportunities and threats out there in the environment around them. They need to be able to share power. We talked about power sharing versus power holding. They need to be able to share some power to empower those around them. They need to be willing to learn, sometimes unlearning and relearning in that process. They need to be visionary, so to have a clear vision, because one of the things that are the most inspiring that a leader can have is that vision. Very rarely are people excited about what I'm going to do, in a very tactical way, these next steps. People get really excited about following a vision. And so I would say, visionary, willing to learn, listen, hyper aware of what's going on around them in the environment. These are some of the things that leaders definitely need going forward in the future.
You met a lot of leaders and top negotiators. Who inspired you the most?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure if I would say, Matthias, the most, but I've been really impressed with watching. I studied and I wrote a case on the business transformation that Angela Ahrendts brought through in Burberry. So she was the former CEO of Burberry, and she really took this company from a stalwart, traditional British fashion brand to one that was super digitally relevant. And I'm very inspired by her story for two reasons. One is that she wasn't a digital expert. So many of the leaders I work with think I'm at a disadvantage because I don't know about Python programming, I don't know about AI, I don't know about machine learning. But again, it's about listening and it's about empowering others. And you have to have some digital literacy, but you don't have to be an expert. And so I really love that she had the courage to take on this transformation, even though she had no background in digital. And I think the other thing that I'm really impressed by is how she made the transition through listening. When she was asked in an interview, what is the advice you would give to a future CEO? She said to listen. She said, I would not be where I am if I was not able to listen. And as a psychologist, I think, one of the things you learn most in a relationship with a client or in any kind of environment is that, yes, we listen with our ears. I'm going to listen, Matthias, with what you're saying, but I'm also listening to everything else. I'm listening to your body language. I'm listening to what you're doing with your hands. I'm listening to how you're holding your body. And so I'm also listening kind of with my full self, my eyes, my heart, my head. And I think it's also in a world now where we can digitally fidget so often, right? Our phone, our computer, are we really present for the people around us? And that small change, right? It might seem really minor. It has massive effects on our willingness to learn.
Thank you again and having an espresso with me. And thank you for inspiring our negotiation community.
My pleasure, Matthias.